This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, welcome back to 1237, back with another review. As I continue my run through of films based on real life serial killers, and this one's going to be a bit different because this isn't necessarily based on really one specific killer. It is more about the investigation of one killer, but it's actually more of a specific era, a specific time of this one investigation on this one killer, but features two of the most notorious serial killers in American history. And it's this one particular story that would go on to inspire. Some people think it inspired Red Dragon, but Red Dragon came out before these events took place, but definitely had an influence on Silence of the Lambs, and that's the 2004 film, The Riverman, which is based on the book, The Riverman, Ted Bundy, and I Hunt the Green River Killer, which this is about when Detective Robert Keppel of Seattle, went to Ted Bundy to get his insight, his opinion, his self-proclaimed expertise on the mind of this killer, the profile of the Green River Killer. Now, yes, Red Dragon is similar to that kind of story. Stuff like that does happen in Red Dragon, but that came out in 81. These events took place in 84. But Silence of the Lambs came out in 88, so the whole thing of going to see this highly intelligent serial killer to catch another one, that definitely inspired Silence of the Lambs. And that, a lot of people think Hannibal Lecter is exactly, Bundy was the main inspiration. Really, the idea of a serial killer being super intelligent, having very fine taste in things like clothes, food, music, and being an expert on serial killers and how to catch them or their minds. That's really what Ted Bundy inspired. Though he was not nearly as smart as people now think he is because of Hannibal Lecter. But yeah, this movie is more about Keppel and his visits to Florida to talk to Bundy about the Green River Killer, only to find out that Bundy is actually kind of profiling himself and leading up to the death row confession tapes in hopes that he will get a death row, a delay in his execution, which that's all true. And I was actually really impressed by this film. I really enjoyed this. Now, judging by the cover, it looks like an Uwe Lamel film. It really does. And that's kind of what I was expecting. Despite having a good cast, you have Bruce Greenwood as Keppel. Of course, he voiced Batman in several animated films like Under the Red Hood. You have Cary Elwes as Bundy. Of course, Dr. Gordon from Saw. Wesley from Princess Bride. All kinds of movies. You have those two as Keppel and Bundy, which they work great together, and their performances are really good. I knew Elwes was going to give a good performance, but I was wondering how he was going to be as Bundy. Of course, he doesn't look like Bundy, but he does do a lot of things that if you go back to interviews or some of the death row tapes, he does do very well. And there are flashbacks to Bundy's kills where, like I said in my review for like the ending of Extremely Wicked, it looks so good and looks so much like what it probably was and is very accurate to what we know that I kind of wish Elwes had his own Bundy movie done like how the flashbacks were done. But the whole movie is good. Now, if this was anything else, I would say it's a cheap knockoff or ripoff of like Silence of the Lambs. Kind of like how my last review, Killer Next Door, I said is basically like Disturbia. if this was any other film, I would say that about Silence of the Lambs, but this was actually really good. It, probably because it's a TV movie. This is another one of those really well done TV movies. This aired on A&E back in 2004. And this is not the only film to depict that event or that one one time of both Bundy's and Green River Killer's timeline of him helping out Keppel and the investigation. There is another film called Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer, directed by Andrew Jones, who did do A Killer Next Door, but he also did like all those stupid Robert the Doll movies and a couple of the newer Amityville films. I thought that was going to be the good one, and this was going to be like the Uwe Lamel film. If you could take that name and cover and associate it with this, solid. Now, of course, the Riverman is the term that Bundy coined for the Green River Killer. Now, it is fairly accurate as far as the events surrounding everything. Now, in reality, Bundy did not really help out that much. Really, the only information that he gave that Keppel and his partner, a Detective Riker, were able to use was the fact that he will return to the dump sites to be with the bodies. That was really the only information that he gave them that they could use in real life. But the movie does do a good job. It does recreate some things. For example, some lines that you'll see in some other interviews. Like, I think it was a Utah interview when Bundy has the beard and the brown sweater. And he says, I don't like people looking at me like I'm some kind of weirdo because I'm not. Cary Elwes says that line. Some of the lines that you'll see, that you'll either see in the Ted Bundy tapes or read in this, he does say, which this is just one of many books that I have on Bundy. And I am so thankful I found, it's not a bootleg, I'm not sure what it is. It says for your Emmy consideration, so I'm guessing it was an extremely limited release of Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes from Netflix. So that's on its way. I'm so glad to finally own that. But yeah, a lot of the lines that Cary Elwes uses is from this, all the way down to where they cut out the Green River stuff and he just gives his confession. And he refers to himself in third person, calling himself or his killer urges the entity. That's featured in this. I was pretty impressed with how accurate this was, and just the stuff that they recreate. Now, one thing, and I will put a picture up, they do recreate one of the most infamous mugshots of Ted Bundy when he first got picked up in Salt Lake City in '75. He got picked up for driving erratically, but this is when they found his essentially his rape kit and linked him to Carol Duranch. They recreated that with Cary Elwes to the point where I think they just photoshopped his face onto it. I could be wrong. But there are scenes in the flashbacks where he has that same hair, and it shows him killing a couple of his victims. One of which they go into detail, with the murder of George Ann Hawkins, his seventh victim, which I was very surprised that they gave her actual name, and we mostly see it in flashback, but it's pretty accurate to what was described, all the way down to her waking up from being hit with the crowbar and talking about having a Spanish test because she's in shock. This goes into all that. So it basically is, Keppel and Reichert investigating Green River, and then Bundy reaches out to Keppel through mail saying, I think I can help you out. And they do kind of give him a Hannibal Lecter edge where he does taunt them. He does kind of make fun of them. He does showboat quite a bit. Uh, there are scenes where it shows what Bundy does when he's by himself in his cell. For example, somehow he's allowed to get Crime Scene magazine, where it shows him looking at it, and you just kind of see his hand go down, implying that that's what he does. But I was impressed by this. It didn't feel like a Silence of the Lambs ripoff. The performances were good. Now, aside from that, it was directed by directed by Bill Eagles, written by Tom Toller, and it was produced by Greg Copeland, Peter Lance, and Hawk Koch. Which, one of them, I think it was Hawk Koch, was a producer on Saw 2, 3, and 4, and P2, because that's what the back of it says. I thought it was Darren Lynn Bousman, but... And I do want to get the book, The Riverman, because that's what it's based on, is a Keppel's book. Now, it also stars Kathleen Quinlan, who was in Hills Have Eyes remake. She was in the Doors movie. She's been in a bunch of stuff. She plays Keppel's wife. Sam Yeager as Reichert. Dave Brown as Gary Ridgway. And I think he did a good job as Ridgway. Later on, at the very end, when you see his confession, he might not look the most like Ridgway, but the way his voice is and some of the things he says and how he talks is very close to the real Ridgway. And it does take the Silence of the Lambs approach where we rarely see Ridgway. I mean, a lot of times when it shows his victims being killed, it'll show the driver in the front seat of a car, but he's like shrouded in silhouette. You'll see a prostitute get in, they drive off, you kind of see a shadow figure dumping her down by the river. So up until much, much later do we actually see Gary Ridgway. So it kind of takes that Lambs approach where we don't really see the killer, or if we do, it's very, very minimal, which creates a mystique. It does work. Cary Elwes does have more time, screen time, than Lecter did in Lambs. I was expecting him to barely be in it, but he is in it actually quite a bit. So, excuse me. And yeah, Keppel picks up fairly right away that Bundy isn't really, I mean, he's kind of talking about Green River, but he's mainly talking about himself, and that the whole thing is kind of a ruse to get him to confess so that hopefully the governor will delay his execution. It didn't work. Now, the timeline of the film, I'm kind of confused on. Some dates they get a little wrong, which is going to happen. But, you know, they make it seem like, you know, because Bundy reached out in 84, which I think it said 83 in the film. They start their correspondence, their interviews. But then at the very end, you know, when we get the voiceover saying, you know, what happened to Reichert, what happened to Ridgway, what Keppel went on to do, and he says 3 days after their final interview, Bundy was executed on January 24th of 89. So I don't know if those confession interviews just, because there are dates in settings in this, but maybe I missed it. But it made it seem like all the interviews were during the Green River era of that 84 period. But maybe at some point he went back and interviewed Bundy for a confession, and maybe I just missed the date. But to me, it felt like the whole movie took place in between 82 and 84. But I guess that final interview was January of 89. Which there even is a line earlier when Bruce Greenwood says, you're going to be executed on Tuesday. The governor doesn't give a shit about you, so you just need to worry about what you can give me between now and Tuesday. I thought it was like a euphemism or something like that, but I guess even then it says, yeah, or it just jumps that far ahead because we do see Gary Ridgway get arrested. We do see him take his polygraph, which he does pass, which did happen. That was in '84. But then it just kind of carries on like everything's close together. So I had no idea that we had jumped 5 years later. But anyway, so it's a very solid film. Again, those damn TV movies are so well made. So now just to go through the film, it opens up August 5th of '82. Reichert says 13 bodies have been found, 10 since June or July. Where in reality, by the end of August of '82, there were only 7 victims. 6 were found. We see that we learned the names of Detective Keppel and Reichert. Those were their names in real life. We do get several flashbacks to Bundy. Like, it says the Bundy Task Force, Seattle 75. It was actually called the Ted Task Force because the name Ted was the only lead that they had. So then we jump to August of '83, which says Bundy reaches out to Keppel by mail. It's true, but it was in October of '84 when he first reached out. A flashback to Bundy on bail, which it said November 75. November 75, it shows Keppel getting the phone call saying he made bail and getting pissed because the judge gave him bail. In real life, it was a $50,000 bail that his parents paid, but it was in October, and he did go back to Seattle. They put him under heavy surveillance. And Cary Elwes looks good as Bundy with the hair and the wardrobe. Like in this scene, he's got one of those huge cardigans that Bundy would wear. So they do a good job at making him look like Bundy. Face, not as much as others. So then we see Ridgway get picked up as a suspect. Mentions he was picked up 3 years ago for soliciting a prostitute, which is true. So that puts us at '84 because he was arrested in '81. It says he attempted to rape a prostitute. I don't ever remember hearing that, which the only book I have on Ridgway would be Ann Rule's Green River Running Red, which is a solid book. Anything by Ann Rule is going to be pretty good. But it shows him getting a polygraph, which he did have. It shows him passing, which he did pass. And the guy that plays Ridgway did do a good job. He might have, maybe if he wore his glasses more, or if they did something more with his hair, then he could have. But he did sound like him, talk like him. So then Bundy starts to confess his crimes, which, and then just to back up and go through some of the interviews, yeah, he toys with Keppel, he toys with Reichert. He's got some of the articles at Green River where he reads that people are sort of making fun of Reichert for not solving the crime. He reads that, Reichert gets pissed. He tells Keppel, I'm sorry to hear that you were sad about those 8 Seattle girls that got away from you. I'm glad to see that you're feeling better. But he does do a lot of, other lectory type of helping them out. He is wearing his yellow over white sweater that you'll see in his January 23rd, '89 interview, his final interview. But, he talks about how to get in the killer's head, like he talks about what trolling is, or, if his victims are found on these days, you might want to look into what kind of job he has. No victims on the weekends, so, does he work weekends? Does he have a family? And it does feel like a good Silence of the Lambs type of interview. getting help from a serial killer. And Elvis does do a good job. Again, some lines are taken straight from other interviews, like the whole people looking at me like I'm a weirdo because I'm not. Um, so, one thing that I don't think happened was Bundy tells him that you have to see what he sees. So, go down to the strip, the red light district, to see what he sees. And so he does. A hooker gets in his car. Then all the cops come out. They try to arrest him. Then they see that he's a detective. They had surveillance. I don't know if that ever happened. I haven't read Keppel's book yet. So I don't know if he ever got stopped or almost arrested for picking up a prostitute. But, so then that's when Keppel realizes, oh, he's not talking Green River. He's talking about himself. So they start the confessional tape. Bundy starts to confess, but he refers to himself in third person. We're talking about an individual. He does this. He likes that. He refers to the individual or his urges as the entity. So whenever Keppel asks, "What did you do to Georgianne?" he says, "You mean what did the entity do?" And so then we get a flashback to Georgianne Hawkins, which was, it does say June the 11th of 74, which that was the date. It shows him, walking through the alley on his crutches with his suitcase. She helps him. It does show his Beetle as not having the front seat and her laying in the car. I think maybe the Corin Nemec film also showed that, but his Beetle was red in that film. So it shows her after he clubbed her with the crowbar. Shows her laying in the front seat and waking up and just kind of talking nonsense in shock about the Spanish test. So then it shows him dragging her into the woods, clubbing her again. Shows him strangling her, which the strangling was only on Bundy's account. They thought she was bludgeoned because all they found was her skull and it was fractured. But it shows him dragging her into the woods. Cut to day. We see him walk out, fixes his fly. And I thought this was a cool transition because he gets in the car, he lights a cigarette, and he looks in the mirror, and then he continues the interview as if he's there. Which I thought that was a neat transition. Like, it's still June 12th at that point, 74. He's in his car, but he's talking like he's still giving the confession. Then it shows Keppel in the back seat, then we cut back to the interrogation room. I thought that was a neat transition. And then Bundy, he even says the line that you'll see in this or the documentary. Like, it's something to the effect of, it's not funny, but it's odd or amusing, the things that people will say under those circumstances, because she woke up thinking she had a Spanish test. Bundy talks about that. That was Georgianne Hawkins. And then Keppel asks him about, why the heads? Why did you keep the heads? We found 4 all in the same area, which means you kept them, then you dumped them all at the same time. Bundy starts to get flustered and angry. And then Keppel leaves. And during the end narration, it says that, he confessed to the 8 in Seattle, including 3 more that we didn't know about. An additional 19, which brings us up to 30. Math is 31. Which I'm guessing the Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach was among the 19. And I think one of the first inklings when Keppel realizes he's talking about himself and not Green River is when Bundy says something like, you got to get inside their head. They all have a world view on things, and you got to figure out what that is. Then you can use it. He asked him for an example. He said, well, there's a guy in here that I was talking to who was telling me about all the women that he killed. but he wouldn't talk about this one young girl that he was accused of raping and killing. Just wouldn't talk about her, because if he did that, he thought people would think of him as a bad person. Bundy would not talk about Kimberly Leach, the 12-year-old that he abducted, raped, and murdered. That was one he was never comfortable talking about. So I think that was the first hint that Keppel got, that he was talking about himself and not Green River. But so then it says he was executed anyway, 3 days later. And yeah, it shows Ridgway being arrested, him confessing. I think some of his lines was from Ridgway's confessional tape, which I have seen. It also says Bundy talked for 9 days straight. 4 days straight. Which, I mean, there were a lot of tapes of Bundy's confession. But that's the Riverman. I mean, yeah, it's kind of, detective procedural, about Green River. It is part Bundy movie and his confessions and seeing brief flashbacks to his crimes. It's actually more about Bundy than it is Gary Ridgway specifically. But it does show Ridgway being arrested and convicted. But it's mostly about Keppel. It is mostly a Robert Keppel film. How true this is to his side of it, or, you know, how true the character is to Keppel the person. But I was very impressed by it. I thought this was very well made, well acted, well shot, well put together, especially being a TV movie. Now I'm no longer surprised. If I come across another one that's a TV movie, I'm already going to assume that it's good, because we're at like 6 for 6 at this point, or however many I've done. But yeah, I thought this was very good. There was one more point I was going to say about Bundy, but I can't remember. But yeah, very solid film. Definitely don't go into it thinking it's going to be a very detailed film about Ridgway, or a very detailed film about Bundy, or a very in-depth detective procedural film. It is more so just about that one time, or that one period where Bundy gave his expertise on how to catch Green River for Robert Keppel. Again, the movie may be a little bit more in-depth than what really happened, or more extensive than what really happened. Because again, the only thing they could really use was when he said he will return to the dump sites to be with the body. I think that was really all law enforcement was able to use from his insight. But that's 2004's The Riverman. I was very impressed. Borderline blown away. I was expecting an Uwe Lamel film, but this was very solid. If you go into one thinking it's going to be like a Uwe Lamel film, even if it's decent or just okay, it's going to feel like it's amazing. But yeah, and I do recommend both of these books as well. And again, I cannot wait until, I think it'll be next week when the DVD of this comes in. So glad to own it. Now, if there could just be some sort of limited release of Gacy and Dahmer tapes, that would be incredible. So, I have a few more serial killer films to get to, so stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.